The first wagon rolled into Jordan Valley, Oregon on a Thursday morning in July 1878, and Katherine Ingram watched from behind the dusty window of his saloon as the most beautiful woman he had ever seen climbed down from the driver's seat with the grace of a dancer and the determination of a general. She wore a simple blue calico dress that had seen better days, her dark hair pinned up beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and when she turned to survey the ramshackle building 10 feet from his establishment, Katherine felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with the whiskey he had been nursing since dawn. Victoria Sterling stood in the morning heat and studied the abandoned structure that would become her boarding house. The wood was weathered gray, the porch sagged in the middle, and one of the shutters hung at an angle that suggested it had given up on life sometime during the previous winter. But the bones were good, the roof looked solid, and most importantly, it was hers. She had paid cash money for it, every cent she had saved from 3 years of working in a San Francisco restaurant, and she would make it work even if it killed her. Katherine pushed through the swinging doors of his saloon and stepped into the brilliant sunlight, squinting against the glare. He was 26 years old, tall and lean from hard living, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of creek water after a storm. He had owned the Lucky Dollar Saloon for 4 years, built it up from nothing into the most profitable business in this dusty corner of Oregon, where cattle ranchers and miners spent their wages on whiskey and cards. The last thing he needed was competition, especially not from a boarding house that would steal his customers with the promise of clean beds and respectable company. "Morning, madam," he called out, his boots crunching on the packed earth as he crossed the narrow space between their buildings. "I'm Katherine Ingram. I own the saloon here." Victoria turned to face him, and he saw that her eyes were green, the bright clear green of new grass after rain. She was younger than he had first thought, maybe 23 or 24, with a determined set to her jaw that suggested she did not suffer fools gladly. "Victoria Sterling," she said, not offering her hand. "I suppose you are here to tell me that I am not welcome." "Did not say that." Katherine hooked his thumbs in his belt loops, trying to appear casual even though his heart was beating faster than it should. "Just wanted to introduce myself. Be neighborly." "Neighborly." She repeated the word as if testing its weight. "That is kind of you, Mr. Ingram. I appreciate it. Now, if you will excuse me, I have a great deal of work to do." She turned her back on him and began unloading supplies from her wagon, and Katherine found himself rooted to the spot, watching the way she moved with such purposeful efficiency. He should have gone back inside. He should have started preparing for the day's business. Instead, he heard himself saying, "You need any help with that?" Victoria paused, a crate of dishes balanced on her hip. "Why would you help me? We are competitors, are we not?" "We do not have to be." The words came out before he could think them through. "Jordan Valley is big enough for both of us." She studied him for a long moment, those green eyes seeing more than he was comfortable with. Then she said, "I doubt that is true, Mr. Ingram. But I will not turn down an extra pair of hands if you are genuinely offering." That was how Katherine found himself spending his Thursday morning hauling furniture and supplies into the decrepit boarding house, while his saloon sat empty. Victoria directed him with the precision of a field marshal, pointing out where she wanted the beds assembled, where the kitchen table should go, how the chairs needed to be arranged. She worked alongside him without pause, her dress growing damp with sweat in the July heat, strands of dark hair escaping her pins to curl around her face. "Where did you come from?" Katherine asked as they wrestled a heavy wardrobe up the narrow stairs to the second floor. "San Francisco most recently. Before that, St. Louis. Before that, it does not matter." Her voice was clipped, discouraging further questions. "What brought you to Jordan Valley? The price was right. They maneuvered the wardrobe through a doorway, and she directed him to set it against the far wall. I needed a place where I could start fresh, and this building was available. That is all there is to it. Katherine did not believe that for a second. Women did not come to places like Jordan Valley alone unless they were running from something or towards something with equal desperation. But he recognized the tone in her voice, the one that said the subject was closed, so he let it drop. By noon, they had the main floor arranged to her satisfaction. The boarding house was small, with a front parlor, a dining room, a kitchen, and a room in the back where Victoria would sleep. Upstairs were 4 bedrooms that she intended to rent out to travelers and workers passing through. It was not fancy, but it was clean and functional, and Katherine could see the vision she had for the place. "Thank you for your help," Victoria said as they stood in the kitchen, both of them dusty and tired. "I appreciate it more than you know. No trouble." Katherine wiped his face with his bandana. "Listen, I should probably mention that most folks around here are not much interested in boarding houses. They come for the saloon, for the whiskey and the gambling. You might have a hard time making a go of it." Victoria smiled, and it transformed her face, turning her from pretty to genuinely beautiful. "I am not worried, Mr. Ingram. Once people taste my cooking, they will come. You will see." He laughed, thinking she was naive, thinking she had no idea what she was up against. He was still laughing when he walked back across to his saloon, and he was still thinking about that smile when his regular customers started trickling in for their afternoon drinks. That evening, Victoria lit every lamp in the boarding house and began cooking. She had no guests yet, no paying customers, but she cooked anyway because she needed to test her new kitchen, needed to make sure everything worked the way it should. She made beef stew thick with vegetables, biscuits that came out of her second-hand oven golden and fluffy, apple pie with a crust so flaky it practically dissolved on the tongue. The smells drifted out through the open windows into the summer evening, and they drifted the 10 feet across to the Lucky Dollar Saloon where men were drinking and playing cards. Old Pete Morrison was the first to notice. He lifted his head from his whiskey like a hound catching a scent. "What is that smell?" "Smells like heaven," his companion said, setting down his cards. Katherine had been behind the bar, polishing glasses and trying not to think about the woman next door. But now the smell hit him too, and his stomach growled despite the fact that he had eaten a cold sandwich an hour ago. It smelled like home, like family dinners he barely remembered from his childhood before his parents died. It smelled like everything the Lucky Dollar Saloon was not. "It is coming from the boarding house," someone said, and suddenly half the men in the saloon were on their feet, drawn toward the door like moths to a flame. Katherine watched in growing dismay as his customers wandered out into the street, following their noses to Victoria's front porch. Through the window, he could see them gathering there, and then he saw Victoria herself appear at the door, still wearing her work dress, her face flushed from the heat of cooking. She said something he could not hear, and then she was inviting them inside, welcoming them into her dining room. He should have stayed where he was. He should have let it go. Instead, Katherine locked up the saloon and followed the crowd. Victoria's dining room was packed with men, all of them seated around the long table she had set up that morning. They were eating her stew and biscuits, and the expressions on their faces were nothing short of rapturous. Victoria moved between them, refilling bowls and cups, answering questions about when she would officially open for business. "Breakfast, lunch, and dinner," she was saying. 50 cents for breakfast, 75 for lunch or dinner, or you can rent a room and board for $6 a week, meals included. "I will take a room," Pete Morrison said immediately, his mouth full of biscuit. I will take a room right now if you will promise to cook like this every day." "That is the plan," Victoria said, and Katherine heard the satisfaction in her voice. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and he saw the challenge in her gaze. She had told him people would come for her cooking, and she had been right. Every man in that room was one of his regular customers, and they were looking at Victoria Sterling like she had just offered them salvation. Katherine turned and walked back to his empty saloon, his jaw tight with anger and something else he did not want to name. This was going to be a problem. A significant problem. Over the next 2 weeks, the situation went from bad to worse. Victoria officially opened her boarding house on a Monday morning, and by Monday evening, all 4 of her rooms were rented. Men who used to spend their evenings in Katherine's saloon were now spending them at Victoria's dinner table. His whiskey sales plummeted. His card games dried up. By the end of the first week, the Lucky Dollar was operating at half capacity, and Katherine was starting to panic. He tried everything he could think of. He lowered his prices. He brought in a piano player from Baker City. He ordered better whiskey. Nothing worked. The men of Jordan Valley had discovered that they preferred Victoria's pot roast and apple dumplings to his rotgut whiskey and stale peanuts, and they were voting with their feet. On a Wednesday evening in early August, Katherine finally swallowed his pride and walked over to the boarding house. He found Victoria in her kitchen, flour dusting her hands as she rolled out pie dough. The window was open to catch the breeze, and the dying sunlight turned her dark hair to copper. "We need to talk," he said from the doorway. Victoria looked up, unsurprised to see him. "Come in, Mr. Ingram." "Would you like some coffee?" "I do not want coffee. I want to understand what you are trying to do here." "I am trying to run a business same as you." She went back to her pie dough, rolling it out with practiced strokes. "What is the problem?" "The problem is that you are killing my business. Half my customers are gone because they would rather eat your food than drink my whiskey." "That is not my problem." Her voice was calm, matter of fact. "I did not ask them to stop going to your saloon. They made that choice themselves." Katherine stepped further into the kitchen, his frustration boiling over. "You knew this would happen. You chose to set up right next to me knowing it would steal my customers." "I chose this building because it was affordable and available." Victoria set down her rolling pin and turned to face him fully. "I am sorry your business is suffering, but I have to eat too. I have to make a living. Why should I feel guilty for being good at what I do? Because you are ruining me." The words came out more raw than he intended, and he saw something flicker in her eyes. Sympathy, maybe, or understanding. "Then maybe you need to change what you are offering," she said quietly. "People are tired of just whiskey and cards, Katherine. They want something more. They want comfort. They want to feel like they have a home, even if it is just for an evening." It was the first time she had used his first name, and the sound of it on her lips did strange things to his chest. He stood there in her kitchen, breathing in the smell of baking and cinnamon, and he realized that he was not just angry. He was jealous. Jealous of the way people looked at her with warmth and gratitude. Jealous of the community she was building in her dining room while his saloon sat cold and empty. "I do not know how to give them that," he admitted, the fight going out of him. Victoria studied him for a long moment, then wiped her hands on her apron. "Can you cook?" "What? Can you cook?" "Anything at all. I can fry bacon and eggs, make coffee, nothing fancy." She nodded slowly as if making a decision. "What if we worked together instead of against each other?" Katherine blinked. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if your saloon started offering food, simple things? Sandwiches, maybe, chili. You could buy it from me, mark it up, sell it to your customers. That way, men who want whiskey and cards can have them along with a decent meal and I get more business out of it." He stared at her, trying to process the offer. "Why would you help me?" "I have been nothing but hostile to you, because I do not want to see you lose everything," Victoria said simply. "And because maybe we both do better if we cooperate instead of compete. What do you say?" Katherine looked at her standing there in her flour-dusted apron, offering him a lifeline he had not expected and probably did not deserve. He thought about his pride, about the anger he had been nursing for 2 weeks. Then he thought about the empty saloon and the bills he was struggling to pay. "All right," he said. "Let us try it." They shook hands on it, and Katherine felt the calluses on her palm, the strength in her grip. This was a woman who worked hard for everything she had, and he found himself respecting that even as he was still wary of her motives. The partnership started small. Victoria prepared pots of chili and stew that Katherine could reheat and serve at the saloon. She made sandwiches in the morning that he sold during lunch. The food was simple but good, and his customers noticed. Slowly, men started coming back to the Lucky Dollar, drawn by the combination of whiskey, cards, and Victoria's cooking. It was not quite what it had been before, but it was better than the hollow emptiness of the previous weeks. As August turned into September, Katherine found himself spending more and more time at the boarding house. He would stop by in the morning to pick up the day's food, and Victoria would offer him coffee. He would return in the evening to settle accounts, and she would invite him to stay for dinner. The boarders did not seem to mind his presence, and gradually, Katherine began to feel like part of the odd little family Victoria was creating. He learned things about her in small increments. She had grown up in St. Louis, the daughter of a riverboat captain who died when she was 16. Her mother had remarried quickly, and Victoria had not gotten along with her stepfather. She had left home at 18 and worked her way west, taking jobs in restaurants and hotels, saving every penny. The boarding house represented her dream of independence, of building something that was entirely her own. "What about you?" she asked him one evening as they sat on her front porch, watching the sun set over the Oregon hills. "How did you end up in Jordan Valley?" Katherine leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking beneath his weight. "My parents had a ranch north of here. They died of influenza when I was 22, and I sold the land rather than try to run it myself. Used the money to buy the saloon. That was 4 years ago." "Do you have any other family, a sister in Portland?" "We write occasionally, but we are not close." He paused, then added, "It is lonely sometimes running a business by yourself. No one to share the success or the failure with." Victoria nodded, understanding in her eyes. "That is why I like having the boarders. It makes the place feel alive, makes me feel less alone." They sat in comfortable silence as the sky turned from gold to purple to deep blue. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked. From the saloon, Katherine could hear the faint sound of men laughing and the clink of glasses. It was a good sound, a sound that meant business was picking up again. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for helping me. You did not have to, I know." Victoria's voice was soft in the gathering darkness. "But I wanted to. You were the first person to offer me help when I arrived, even though I was too stubborn to accept it gracefully. I figured I owed you the same courtesy." Katherine turned to look at her, and in the twilight her profile was outlined against the last light of day. He realized with a start that he was falling for her, had been falling for her since that first morning when she climbed down from her wagon with such determination. The realization should have terrified him, but instead, it felt right, as inevitable as the sunset they were watching. September brought cooler weather and an influx of cattle ranchers preparing for the winter. Jordan Valley's population swelled temporarily, and both the boarding house and the saloon did brisk business. Victoria hired a local girl named Sarah to help with the cooking and cleaning. and Katherine hired a bartender so he could spend more time managing the business end of things. They were both working long hours, but they made time for each other, meeting on the porch in the evenings or sharing coffee in the early morning before the day's rush began. It was during one of those early morning conversations that Victoria told him about her stepfather. They were sitting in her kitchen, the sun just starting to rise, and she was making biscuits while Katherine drank his coffee. "He was not a bad man exactly," she said, her hands working the dough with practiced efficiency. "But he resented my presence. Thought I was a burden, an expense he had not signed up for when he married my mother. He made it clear that I was expected to earn my keep, and when I turned 18, he suggested I find a husband or find somewhere else to live." Katherine felt anger rise in his chest. "What did your mother say?" "She sided with him. She wanted peace in her marriage, and I was the thing disrupting it." Victoria's voice was matter-of-fact, but Katherine heard the old hurt beneath it. "So I left. I have not spoken to either of them in 6 years." "I am sorry," Katherine said, meaning it. "Do not be. It was the best thing that could have happened to me. It made me strong, made me independent." She looked up from her biscuits, meeting his eyes. "I do not need anyone to take care of me, Katherine. I never have, and I never will." He heard the warning in her words, understood what she was telling him. Victoria Sterling was not a woman who would give up her independence for anyone, not even for love. If he wanted a place in her life, it would have to be as an equal partner, not as someone who tried to control or protect her. "I would not want to take care of you," he said carefully. "But maybe we could take care of each other, if you were interested in that sort of arrangement." Victoria's hands stilled in the dough. She looked at him for a long moment, her green eyes searching his face. "Are you proposing something, Katherine Ingram?" "I am saying that I have feelings for you, strong feelings. And I think maybe you have feelings for me too, though you are too stubborn to admit it." He set down his coffee cup and stood, moving closer to where she worked. "I am saying that I like spending time with you, that I look forward to these mornings more than anything else in my day. That when I am not with you, I am thinking about you." Victoria's cheeks had flushed pink, and she was staring down at her biscuit dough as if it held the secrets of the universe. "Katherine, I do not know if I am ready for this. I have worked so hard to build something of my own. I cannot risk losing it." "You would not lose anything. The boarding house is yours. It would always be yours." He reached out and gently took her flour-dusted hand in his. "I am not asking you to give up your independence. I am asking if maybe we could build something together while keeping what we have built separately. A partnership. In business and in life." She looked up at him then, and he saw the longing in her eyes, the fear, the hope. "What if it does not work? What if we try this and it ruins everything?" "What if it does work?" he countered. "What if we are both missing out on something amazing because we are too scared to try?" Victoria pulled her hand from his and turned away, moving to the window where the morning light was growing stronger. Katherine waited, giving her time to think, his heart pounding so hard he was sure she could hear it. Finally, she said, "I do have feelings for you. I have tried not to because it seemed complicated and risky. But I think about you all the time. I find excuses to see you. When you walk into a room, I feel like I can breathe better." She turned back to face him, her expression vulnerable in a way he had never seen. "I am terrified, Katherine, terrified of needing someone, terrified of being hurt." He crossed the kitchen in 3 strides and took her in his arms, pulling her close. She stiffened for just a moment, then melted against him, her head coming to rest against his chest. He could feel her heart beating, fast and strong, matching the rhythm of his own. "I am terrified too," he admitted, his lips against her hair. "But I think maybe being terrified together is better than being safe and alone." Victoria pulled back just enough to look up at him, and then she was kissing him, fierce and sweet and full of all the emotion she usually kept locked away. Katherine kissed her back with everything he had, tasting flour and coffee and the promise of a future he had not let himself hope for. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. Victoria laughed, a genuine sound of joy that made Katherine's heart soar. "Well," she said, "I suppose we are doing this then." "I suppose we are," he agreed, grinning like a fool. The next few months were a whirlwind of work and romance, and learning how to be together. They kept their businesses separate, as Victoria insisted, but they became inseparable in every other way. Katherine spent most nights at the boarding house, helping Victoria with the dinner service, and then sitting with her on the porch long after the boarders had gone to bed. They talked about everything, their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. They learned each other's rhythms. The way Victoria was cheerful in the mornings but got quiet and thoughtful in the evenings. The way Katherine was gruff before his first coffee but mellowed as the day went on. The town noticed, of course. Jordan Valley was small enough that nothing went unnoticed, and the relationship between the saloon owner and the boarding house proprietor was the subject of considerable gossip. Most folks were happy for them, though there were a few who muttered about propriety and what was proper for an unmarried woman. Victoria ignored the gossip with her usual determination, and Katherine found that he did not care what anyone thought as long as Victoria was by his side. Winter came early that year, with snow falling in October and temperatures dropping fast. Katherine made sure Victoria had enough firewood stacked, and she made sure he was eating properly instead of surviving on whiskey and whatever he could grab between customers. They took care of each other in small ways, the kind of everyday intimacy that built a foundation stronger than any grand gesture. It was on a cold December evening, with snow falling outside and a fire crackling in the boarding house parlor, that Katherine asked Victoria to marry him. He had been planning something elaborate, but in the end, the words just came out naturally as they sat together on the sofa, Victoria's feet tucked under her and her head on his shoulder. "Marry me," he said, and felt her go still against him. "Katherine, I know you value your independence. I know the boarding house is yours and you want to keep it that way. Nothing has to change except your name if you do not want it to." He shifted so he could look at her properly. "But I love you, Victoria. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want to build a real family with you. So what do you say? Will you marry me?" Victoria's eyes were bright with tears, but she was smiling. "I love you too, so much it scares me sometimes. And yes, Katherine Ingram, I will marry you." He kissed her then, deep and thorough, and when they finally came up for air, Victoria was laughing through her tears. "We should probably tell people," she said, "before the gossip gets even more out of hand." "Let them gossip," Katherine said, pulling her close again. "I do not care about anything except you." They were married in January 1879 in the small church at the center of Jordan Valley. The ceremony was simple, attended by the boarders, the saloon regulars, and most of the town. Victoria wore a cream-colored dress she had sewn herself, and Katherine wore his best suit. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the assembled crowd erupted in cheers, and Katherine kissed his bride while snow fell gently outside the church windows. The reception was held at the boarding house, with tables set up in every available space and food enough to feed an army. Victoria had been cooking for days, assisted by Sarah and several of the town's women who had insisted on helping. There was roasted beef and ham, potatoes and vegetables, pies and cakes of every variety. The whiskey came from Katherine's saloon, and someone had brought a fiddle, and soon the whole place was filled with music and laughter and dancing. Katherine danced with his wife, marveling at the fact that he could call her that now. Victoria looked radiant, her cheeks flushed with happiness and exertion, her eyes sparkling. When the song ended, she leaned up and whispered in his ear, "I think this is the happiest day of my life." "Mine too," he whispered back, and meant it with every fiber of his being. They spent their wedding night in Victoria's room at the boarding house, and Katherine made love to his wife with a tenderness that surprised them both. Afterward they lay tangled together under the quilts, Victoria's head on his chest, his arms wrapped around her. "I was so scared of this," Victoria murmured into the darkness. "Scared of needing you, scared of losing myself. You feel like you have lost yourself?" Katherine asked, his hand stroking her hair. "No," she said, wonder in her voice. "I feel like I have found something I did not even know I was looking for, like I am more myself with you than I ever was alone." Katherine held her tighter, his heart so full he thought it might burst. "I feel the same way. Like you make me better, make me want to be better." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other and in the promise of all the years ahead. The first year of marriage was an adjustment. They decided to live at the boarding house since it had more space, and Katherine hired a manager for the saloon so he did not have to be there every night. Victoria continued running her business with the same fierce determination. But now Katherine was there to help with the heavy work, to manage the books, to provide a steady presence when things got hectic. They fought sometimes, both of them being strong-willed and stubborn. Victoria would get angry when she thought Katherine was trying to take over, and Katherine would get frustrated when Victoria refused to ask for help even when she clearly needed it. But they learned how to fight fair, how to listen to each other, how to compromise without either of them feeling diminished. The boarding house thrived under their joint management. Word spread about Victoria's cooking, and travelers went out of their way to stop in Jordan Valley just for a meal at her table. Katherine expanded the saloon, adding a restaurant section where they could serve her food in a more formal setting. It was the best of both worlds, respectable enough for families, but still wild enough for cowboys and miners who wanted a drink after a long day. In the spring of 1880, Victoria discovered she was pregnant. She was terrified and thrilled in equal measure, worried about how a baby would affect her ability to work, but excited about the prospect of starting a family. Katherine was over the moon, already planning how they would convert one of the upstairs rooms into a nursery. "What if I am not a good mother?" Victoria asked him one night as they lay in bed, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. "You will be an amazing mother," Katherine assured her. "You take care of everyone already. This is just one more person to love. But what if the business suffers? What if I cannot manage both? Then we will hire more help. We will figure it out together." He covered her hand with his own. "You do not have to do everything yourself anymore, Victoria. That is what having a partner means." She turned to look at him, her eyes soft in the lamplight. "How did I get so lucky to find you?" "I think I am the lucky one," he said, and kissed her until she stopped worrying and started smiling again. Their son was born in October, a healthy baby boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes. They named him Thomas, after Katherine's father, and from the moment Katherine held his son for the first time, he knew that his heart was capable of expanding in ways he had never imagined. Victoria was a natural mother despite her fears, nursing the baby and managing the boarding house with equal competence, though she did finally agree to hire more help. The boarding house became a true home with Thomas in it. The boarders doted on the baby, and regular customers would stop by just to see how he was growing. Victoria learned to cook with a baby on her hip, and Katherine learned to change diapers and warm bottles in the middle of the night. They were exhausted and happy and more in love than ever. As Thomas grew from a baby into a toddler, the boarding house and saloon continued to prosper. Jordan Valley was growing too, with new families moving in and new businesses opening. The town was becoming civilized, or at least as civilized as anywhere in Oregon could be in the 1880s. They got a proper schoolhouse, a telegraph office, a general store that carried goods from as far away as San Francisco. Katherine and Victoria became pillars of the community, respected for their hard work and their fairness. When a new family arrived in town with nowhere to stay, Victoria would find them a room and defer payment until they could afford it. When a cowboy got into trouble and needed a job, Katherine would hire him at the saloon, giving him a chance to earn an honest wage. They gave back to the town that had given them so much, and people loved them for it. In 1882, Victoria became pregnant again. This time, she was less frightened and more confident, secure in the knowledge that she could balance motherhood and business. Their daughter was born in May 1883, a beautiful little girl they named Margaret after Victoria's mother, in a gesture of forgiveness that Victoria said she needed to make for her own peace of mind. Margaret had her father's gray-green eyes and her mother's determination, evident even in infancy. With 2 children, the boarding house became even more chaotic and wonderful. Thomas, now 2½, was intensely curious about everything, and Margaret was a colicky baby who required constant attention. Katherine and Victoria took turns walking the floor with her, singing lullabies and snatching sleep whenever they could. Sarah, who had been with them for years now, was invaluable, helping with both the children and the business. "I never imagined this," Victoria said to Katherine one evening as they sat on their porch, watching Thomas chase fireflies in the yard while Margaret slept in Victoria's arms. "When I came to Jordan Valley, I just wanted to survive, to build something that was mine. I never dreamed I could have all of this. A husband who loves me, children, a real home." Katherine put his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "You deserve all of it and more. You worked for it. You earned it." "We earned it," Victoria corrected, leaning into him. "Together." The years passed in a blur of cooking and child-rearing, of business expansion and community involvement. In 1885, they opened a second boarding house on the other side of town, this one catering specifically to families and long-term residents. In 1887, Katherine sold the Lucky Dollar Saloon to his former bartender, deciding he would rather focus on the restaurant business and spend more time with his growing family. It was a good decision, one that gave him more freedom and less stress. Thomas started school in 1885, a bright boy who loved books and numbers. Margaret followed him in 1888, more interested in people than academics, but charming everyone she met. Victoria and Katherine attended school plays and spelling bees, hosted birthday parties, and nursed their children through childhood illnesses. They had fights and reconciliations, moments of doubt and moments of perfect clarity. They grew together, 2 independent people who had chosen to build a life as partners. In 1889, Victoria's mother wrote to her for the first time in over a decade. The letter was short and stilted, but it was an olive branch, and Victoria accepted it as such. She wrote back, telling her mother about her life, her husband, her children. They began a correspondence that would never be deeply close, but that provided a measure of healing for old wounds. The boarding houses continued to thrive through the 1890s. Jordan Valley grew into a proper town, with paved streets and electric lights and all the modern conveniences. Katherine and Victoria adapted their businesses to the changing times, always staying one step ahead of their competition. They hired good people and treated them well, and in return, their employees were loyal and hardworking. In 1895, on a cold December evening much like the one when Catherine had proposed, they sat together on their porch despite the chill. The children were inside doing homework, the boarders were settled for the night, and for once, everything was quiet. "You remember when we first met?" Catherine asked, his arm around Victoria's shoulders as they shared a blanket. "Of course. You came strutting over to warn me off your territory, all bristling and defensive." Victoria laughed at the memory. "I thought you were insufferable. I thought you were going to ruin me, and you did, in a way, ruined me for ever being alone again." He kissed the top of her head. "Best thing that ever happened to me, you rolling into town with your wagon and your determination. We have had a good life, have we not?" Victoria's voice was soft, reflective. "Better than I ever dreamed possible." "The best life," Catherine agreed, "and it is not over yet. We have years ahead of us still. Years to watch our children grow, to build the businesses even more, to grow old together." Victoria snuggled closer to him, content in the warmth of his embrace and the certainty of their love. They sat there as the stars came out. Two people who had found each other in an unlikely place and built something beautiful together. Thomas graduated from high school in 1897 and announced his intention to study law in Portland. Victoria cried when he left for the city, even though she was proud of his ambitions. Margaret, then 14, assured her mother that she had no intention of leaving Jordan Valley, that she planned to help run the boarding houses when she was old enough. This comforted Victoria somewhat, though Catherine pointed out that Margaret might change her mind as she got older. The turn of the century came and went, bringing with it new technologies and new challenges. The boarding house business changed as railroads made travel easier and hotels sprang up in larger towns. But Victoria adapted, focusing more on long-term residents and families, creating a reputation for the best home-cooked meals in Eastern Oregon. The restaurant side of the business became their main focus, and they did well, better than well. In 1903, Thomas returned from Portland with a law degree and a wife, a smart young woman named Caroline who had grown up in the city. They settled in Jordan Valley, where Thomas opened a law practice, and within a year, Victoria and Catherine became grandparents. Their grandson, named Catherine after his grandfather but called Kit to avoid confusion, was born in the spring of 1904, and Victoria declared him the most beautiful baby she had ever seen besides her own children. Margaret, true to her word, had stayed in Jordan Valley and taken on more responsibility in the family businesses. At 21, she was as competent as her mother had been at that age, though with a gentler temperament. She had a beau, a young rancher named David who worked land north of town, and Catherine suspected there would be another wedding in the family before long. "We are getting old," Victoria said to Catherine one night as they prepared for bed. She was 51 now, her dark hair liberally streaked with silver, her figure a bit rounder than it had been in her youth. But to Catherine, she was as beautiful as the day she first arrived in Jordan Valley. "Speak for yourself," he teased, though at 53 he knew he was showing his age too. His hair had gone gray at the temples, and his back ached after long days of work. "I am serious. We should start thinking about slowing down, letting Margaret take over more of the day-to-day operations." Victoria sat at her dressing table brushing out her hair. "I am tired, Catherine. Good tired, but tired nonetheless." He came up behind her, taking the brush from her hand and running it through her hair himself, something he had done countless times over the years. "Then we will slow down. We have worked hard enough for 10 lifetimes. It is time to let the next generation take the reins." They began the process of transitioning the businesses to Margaret and Thomas, teaching them everything they knew about running a boarding house and restaurant. It was not always smooth. Margaret and Thomas had their own ideas about how things should be done, and sometimes those ideas conflicted with their parents' way of doing things. But eventually, they found a balance, the older generation providing wisdom and experience while the younger generation brought energy and innovation. In 1906, Margaret married her rancher, and the wedding was the social event of the season in Jordan Valley. Victoria cried again, though these were happy tears, tears of joy at seeing her daughter so happy and so loved. David was a good man, steady and kind, and Katherine approved of him wholeheartedly. By 1908, Katherine and Victoria had mostly retired from active management of the businesses. They still lived at the original boarding house, now run by Margaret and David, and they helped out when needed, but mostly they spent their time enjoying each other's company and their grandchildren. Thomas and Caroline had given them 2 more grandchildren, and Margaret and David had a daughter of their own. The house was always full of noise and laughter and love. On a warm evening in June 1910, Katherine and Victoria celebrated their 31st wedding anniversary with a quiet dinner on their porch. The boarding house was full, as always, but Margaret had insisted on giving them privacy for the evening. They ate Victoria's famous pot roast, which she insisted on making herself despite Margaret's offers to do it, and they drank wine and watched the sun set over the hills they had called home for so long. 31 years, Victoria marveled, her hand in Katherine's. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like forever. Both, Katherine said. It is both. Every day with you feels new, but I cannot remember what life was like without you. Do you have any regrets? Victoria asked, her green eyes, faded now but still bright with intelligence, searching his face. Katherine thought about it seriously, wanting to give her an honest answer. No, he finally said. Not a single one. Everything we have been through, good and bad, brought us to this moment. Brought us this life. How could I regret any of that? Victoria smiled, the same smile that had captivated him 32 years ago when she first arrived in Jordan Valley. I do not have any regrets either. I thought I would, you know. Thought I would always wonder what my life could have been if I had stayed independent, if I had never married. But I do not. This life with you has been more than I ever dreamed possible. They sat together as the stars came out, holding hands and remembering. They remembered the early days when they were competitors and then reluctant allies. They remembered falling in love despite their fears. They remembered building a life together, brick by brick, day by day. They remembered the birth of their children and the growth of their businesses. They remembered fights and reconciliations, triumphs and setbacks, ordinary days and extraordinary moments. I love you, Katherine said, the words as true now as they had been the first time he spoke them. I will always love you. I love you too, Victoria replied, leaning her head on his shoulder. Until the end of time. The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own joys and sorrows. In 1912, Victoria's mother passed away, and though they had never fully reconciled, Victoria mourned her loss. In 1914, the world erupted into war in Europe, though America stayed out of it for the moment. In Jordan Valley, life continued much as it always had, insulated from the wider world by distance and the rhythm of agricultural life. Katherine and Victoria grew older together, their bodies slowing but their minds still sharp, their love for each other deepening with each passing year. They became the town's beloved elders, the couple everyone pointed to as an example of what a good marriage should be. Young couples would come to them for advice, and Victoria would feed them while Katherine dispensed wisdom about patience and compromise, and the importance of never going to bed angry. In 1917, when America entered the Great War, Thomas tried to enlist despite being 40 years old. Victoria talked him out of it, reminding him that he had a family to think about and that he could serve his country better by staying home and supporting the war effort from Jordan Valley. It was one of the few times Katherine saw real fear in his wife's eyes, the fear of losing her son to the horror of modern warfare. The war ended in 1918, bringing relief and celebration to Jordan Valley. That same year, the Spanish influenza swept through Oregon, killing thousands. The boarding house became a makeshift hospital, with Victoria and Margaret nursing the sick, despite the risk to themselves. Katherine forbade Victoria from putting herself in danger, and she told him gently but firmly that she would do what was right regardless of his fears. In the end, their family was spared, though several people in town died, including old Pete Morrison, one of Katherine's first customers from the early days of the Saloon. The 1920s brought prosperity and change. Jordan Valley finally got a proper automobile road connecting it to the rest of Oregon. The boarding house business adapted again, now catering to automobile tourists who were exploring the West in their Model T Fords. Margaret and David ran the businesses with skill and innovation, while Thomas's law practice thrived. Katherine and Victoria's grandchildren were growing up, some of them leaving for college, others staying to build lives in Jordan Valley. In 1925, Katherine and Victoria celebrated their 46th wedding anniversary. They were both in their 70s now, moving more slowly but still active and engaged with life. They spent their days reading, working in Victoria's garden, playing with their great-grandchildren, and enjoying the peaceful life they had built together. "Do you remember when you told me that once people tasted your cooking, they would come?" Katherine asked Victoria one afternoon as they sat in the garden, watching the bees work among the flowers. Victoria laughed, a sound that had not changed despite her age. "I remember. You did not believe me. You thought I was naive. I was wrong about that, wrong about a lot of things, actually." He reached over and took her hand, marveling at how familiar it felt in his own. "But I was right about one thing. I knew even then that you were going to change my life. I just did not know how much or how wonderful it would be." "We changed each other's lives," Victoria corrected, squeezing his hand. "That is what love does. It transforms us into better versions of ourselves." They sat together in the afternoon sun, two people who had found each other against the odds and built a legacy that would outlast them both. The boarding house still stood 10 feet from where the Lucky Dollar Saloon had once been, a testament to the rivalry that had turned into the greatest partnership either of them had ever known. In 1928, Katherine fell ill with pneumonia. It was a cold winter, and despite Victoria's careful nursing and the doctor's best efforts, he struggled to recover. For several weeks, his life hung in the balance, and Victoria rarely left his bedside. She read to him, held his hand, and told him stories of their life together, willing him to fight to stay with her just a little longer. Katherine pulled through, but the illness left him weakened. He was no longer able to do much physical work, and he spent most of his days in a chair by the window, watching the life of the boarding house continue around him. Victoria stayed close, always within reach, making sure he was comfortable and cared for. "I am not ready to leave you yet," he told her one day as she brought him his lunch on a tray. "Good," she said firmly, settling into the chair beside him, "because I am not ready to let you go. We have at least another 20 years together, Katherine Ingram, so you had better start taking better care of yourself." He smiled at her determination, the same determination that had brought her to Jordan Valley 50 years ago. "Yes, madam, whatever you say." He did recover, slowly but surely, and by the spring of 1929 he was back on his feet, though Victoria kept a close watch on him. The stock market crashed that October, plunging the nation into the Great Depression, but the effects were slower to reach Jordan Valley. The boarding house continued to operate, though times were leaner. Victoria and Margaret started offering meals for those who could not pay, never turning away anyone who was hungry, and Katherine used his savings to keep local families afloat when the banks foreclosed on their properties. "We have been blessed," Victoria told Katherine when he questioned whether they could afford to be so generous. "We have more than enough. It is our responsibility to help those who have less." The Depression years were hard, but the family weathered them together. Thomas's law practice suffered as people could not afford to pay for services, so he started taking cases for trade, accepting chickens and vegetables and labor instead of cash. Margaret and David kept the boarding house and restaurant running through sheer determination and Victoria's reputation for the best food in Oregon. The family pulled together, supporting each other through the lean times. In 1933, Katherine and Victoria celebrated their 54th wedding anniversary. They were both in their late 70s now, white-haired and wrinkled but still sharp-minded and deeply in love. The celebration was small, just family, but it was filled with joy and gratitude for all the years they had been given together. 54 years, Katherine marveled as they sat together that evening. More than half a century. That is a lifetime. "It is 2 lifetimes," Victoria said. "The life I had before you, and the life I have had with you. And this second life has been infinitely better." They kissed, gentle and sweet, the kiss of 2 people who had loved each other through every season of life and would continue loving each other until their last breath. The years of the mid-1930s brought recovery and hope. The Depression began to ease, and life in Jordan Valley slowly returned to something resembling normal. Katherine and Victoria spent their days peacefully, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, a legacy of love that extended far beyond the businesses they had built. In 1936, on a warm summer evening much like the one 58 years earlier when Victoria had first arrived in Jordan Valley, she and Katherine sat on their porch watching the sunset. Victoria was 81 now, Katherine 84, and they both knew they were living on borrowed time. But they were not afraid. They had lived full lives, loved deeply, and left the world better than they found it. "When I die," Victoria said quietly, her hand in Katherine's, "I want you to know that you made my life complete. You gave me everything I never knew I needed." "I am not ready to talk about this," Katherine said, his voice rough with emotion. "We have to talk about it sometime. We are not young anymore." Victoria squeezed his hand. "Promise me that when I am gone, you will not grieve too long. Promise me you will live whatever time you have left with joy, not sorrow." "I cannot promise that," Katherine said honestly. "Losing you will break my heart, but I promise I will try. I will try to remember all the joy we had together and be grateful for it." "That is all I ask," Victoria said, and they sat together in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear. Victoria passed away peacefully in her sleep in October 1936, just a few weeks after that conversation. She went to bed beside Katherine as she had done for 57 years, and in the morning, she simply did not wake up. Katherine held her hand and wept, his heart shattering even as he knew she would not have wanted him to fall apart. The funeral was attended by half of Jordan Valley, people coming to pay their respects to a woman who had fed them, housed them, and cared for them for nearly 6 decades. Margaret delivered a eulogy that had everyone in tears, talking about her mother's strength and kindness and unwavering love. Thomas spoke about how his mother had taught him the meaning of hard work and integrity. And Katherine, though he could barely speak through his grief, stood and said simply, "She was the best thing that ever happened to me. I loved her with everything I had, and I will love her until we meet again." After Victoria's death, Katherine lived at the boarding house surrounded by his family. Margaret and David made sure he was never alone, never lacked for company or care. His grandchildren and great-grandchildren visited regularly, and he found comfort in their presence, in the tangible evidence of the legacy he and Victoria had created together. He spent his days remembering, going through old photographs and letters, telling stories to anyone who would listen about the remarkable woman he had been lucky enough to marry. He talked about how she had arrived in Jordan Valley with nothing but determination and a wagon load of supplies. How she had built a business that became the heart of the community. How she had loved fiercely and lived fully and taught him what it meant to be truly happy. She changed everything. He told his great-grandson Kit one afternoon as they sat together in the garden Victoria had loved. "Before her, I was just surviving, just going through the motions. She taught me how to live, how to love, how to be part of something bigger than myself." Kit, who was 32 now with children of his own, listened with the patience of a man who understood the importance of preserving these stories. "You changed her life too, Grandpa. She told me once that you made her believe in love when she thought it was not for her." Katherine smiled through his tears. "We were good for each other. That is the secret, you know, finding someone who makes you better, someone who challenges you and supports you and loves you even when you are difficult. Your great-grandmother was all of that and more." As the months passed, Katherine's health began to fail. He was 85, and the doctor said his heart was simply wearing out. He was not in pain, but he was tired, ready to rest. On a cold December night in 1937, just over a year after Victoria's death, Katherine lay in his bed surrounded by his children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. "Do not be sad," he told them, his voice weak but steady. "I have lived a long, good life. I loved and was loved. I built something meaningful. I have no regrets. We love you, Dad," Thomas said, tears streaming down his face. "I love you all," Katherine replied. "Take care of each other. Honor your mother's memory by being kind, by working hard, by loving well. That is all she would have wanted." He closed his eyes then, and with his family around him and Victoria's name on his lips, Katherine Ingram slipped peacefully away. The boarding house that Victoria had opened 10 feet from Katherine's Saloon continued to operate for another 50 years, run by Margaret and David, and then by their children and grandchildren. It became a Jordan Valley institution, a place where people came not just for food and lodging, but for the sense of family and community that Victoria had built into its very foundation. The restaurant side of the business thrived well into the 1980s, and even after the original building was eventually torn down to make way for modern development, the Sterling Ingram family maintained a restaurant in Jordan Valley that served Victoria's recipes and kept her memory alive. Thomas became a respected judge, serving on the Oregon State Bench for 20 years. Margaret lived to be 97, regaling her great-great-grandchildren with stories of her remarkable parents. Kit followed his great-grandfather into business, becoming a successful entrepreneur, while never forgetting the lessons of hard work and integrity that had been passed down through the generations. The love story of Katherine and Victoria became part of Jordan Valley's history, told and retold until it took on the quality of legend. But for those who had known them, it was simply the truth. Two stubborn, independent people who had found each other in an unlikely place and built a love that lasted a lifetime and beyond. They had started as competitors, become partners, and ended as soulmates, proving that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places. In the small cemetery on the hill overlooking Jordan Valley, two graves sit side by side, the headstones weathered now but still legible. Katherine Ingram, 1852, 1937, and Victoria Sterling Ingram, 1855–1936. On warm summer evenings, when the sun sets over the Oregon hills, and the breeze carries the scent of sage and wildflowers, people say you can still feel their presence, still sense the love that bound them together in life and in death. And in the town below, the legacy they built together continues, a testament to the power of hard work, determination, and a love that conquered all obstacles to create something truly beautiful.